Okay, everybody. Now we are going to focus on Chapter 17. Title of this chapter is Biopsychology of Emotion, Stress, and Health. Fear, the dark side of emotion. So let's get started. Biopsychology of Emotion, as an introduction, they started off with this story about Phineas Cage. Phineas Cage was an individual that was working in the railroad, basically, many years ago. I believe that this happened in 1848, so quite a while ago, and he was putting explosives down in. They would drill a hole, put the explosives down there, and then tamp it down with an iron. And when he was tamping down the iron, the explosive went off. The tamping iron went up through the bottom of his throat area, up and through his the top of his skull. And so there was severe damage to the medial prefrontal lobes. So what ended up, believe it or not, I mean, Phineas Cage lived through this, and you can see on page 425 where the iron, the pathway that it took through his brain. So he did survive, but there were many personality changes that they noticed in the individual. And what that was is because the prefrontal lobes were now separated from the rest of the brain. So you can think of it in this way as, let's say you have a lower order animal, you have an alligator or something like that. Not a lot of frontal lobe area, no prefrontal lobe areas. So we know that those areas are specific for critical thinking and emotions and judgment, those kinds of things. Alligator doesn't have those. Alligator thinks, okay, in order for me to survive, I need to eat. I need to prey on some other animal, eat, and basically that's it. Eat, sleep, drink, and stay alive. So those areas in Phineas Cage's brain were still there, the hindbrain, the midbrain. So the drives, think about the hypothalamus, the drives for thirst, for hunger, that kind of thing. If those are now separated from the frontal lobes, now you lose those judgment centers. So it's like, okay, well, I need to eat. Well, I need to eat right now. Well, let's just hold off another half an hour and then we'll eat in a little bit. Let's get our work done first. All that kind of cognitive process is now gone. So he became very impulsive. They also talked about his language, his aggressiveness, and so those were, and that makes sense because of the separation from the frontal lobes to the hindbrain, midbrain areas. Okay, and yeah, here's actually the diagram figure 17.1 that shows you that. And then there's also Darwin's theory of the evolution of emotion. So what we're doing is we're going to give you 4 or 5 different examples of where emotion and anger, fear, where it exists in the brain, how we've happened upon different areas of the brain. And as you've noticed throughout the entire textbook, it's pretty much been a common theme that individuals that are critically injured or have these lesions, have brain damage, a stroke, something like that hinders a certain area of the brain, that those are the individuals that we've learned from, right? Okay, Darwin's theory, expressions of emotion evolve from behaviors that indicate what an animal is likely to do next. If an emotional signal is beneficial, then they will evolve to more effectively communicate and may lose their original meaning. So the idea here is like with the dog species is in your book, and it shows you an example of an aggressive behavior and a submissive behavior. And if you have this alpha dog that oftentimes uses the aggressive behavior and other dogs see this as an effective tool, then they use that also. And so the these emotions then evolve over time because they've been beneficial to the species. Okay, and then we get to some other theories here. We have the James Lang, 2 individuals there, and then Cannon Barr are also 2 different individuals. In the James Lang theory, the stimulus triggers autonomic skeletal response, which then triggers the emotion. So the autonomic response is necessary for the emotion. So if you think about this, you open up a gate, you see a dog right in front of you. That dog is growling and everything else. And what happens? What do you experience? Well, your heart starts racing and your stomach like sinks and you get butterflies in the stomach and all those kinds of things. He's saying that that physiological change is what's needed to trigger the emotion. Okay, and so those physiological changes would trigger the emotion of fear in that case. And then Can and Bard, what they mentioned is that the stimulus triggers autonomic skeletal response and emotion. So the skeletal response is independent of emotion. Okay, and so you think about it. Well, I'm not too sure if James Lang if that was the whole story there, because I think I can feel. When I open that gate and I see the dog, I think I can feel fear at the same time I feel my heart racing. So it's not as a result of my heart racing, but it's actually happening at the same time. So that would be more of the Cannon-Barr theory. Now we know that both of these are actually not correct. And on the next slide, we'll show you where we are today. Okay, so figure 17.3, 4 ways of thinking about the relations among the perception of emotion-inducing stimuli and the autonomic somatic responses. So at the very top, the common sense view, perception of bear, feeling of bear, physiological reactions. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you have the James Lang, perception of bear, causes the physiological changes, and then that is the result of fear. Okay, or sorry, the fear is the result of physiological reactions. Cannon-Bard, you have the perception of bear that actually can cause the feeling of fear and cause the physiological reactions at the same time. And then at the very bottom is where we are today. The modern biopsychological view is perception of bear, again, can cause the physiological reaction, can cause the feeling of fear. So that maps out very similar to the Cannon-Barr theory. Okay, but then the physiological responses themselves can trigger the perception of the bear. The feeling of fear by itself can trigger the perception of bear, and also you have the interaction of the feeling of fear and physiological reactions. Okay, so it's a full circle. Another example is sham rage. So decorticated cats exhibit extreme and unfocused aggressive responses. The hypothalamus must be intact. What happens here in a decorticated cat is that the cortex has been severed. So the telencephalon basically is removed and cannot communicate to the other areas, the diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, so on. Okay. Now the hypothalamus must be intact in this case, and perhaps the hypothalamus is needed for expression of aggression and the cortex serves to inhibit and direct responses. Aha. All right, so now this is going back to, of course, they didn't know this back when Phineas Cage was hurt, right, 1848, but I kind of alluded to this idea that the expression of aggression and the cortex serves to inhibit because of the higher order cortical functioning, like with judgment and critical thinking and so on, that can back one away from it's kind of the perception of, you bump into somebody and then that person is just triggered and they start fighting and everything else. That would be the normal reflex, right, without the cortical areas providing judgment over that individual, critical thinking skills, and saying, well, no, this isn't the place or the time to get into a fight. You need to calm down. Okay. We've already talked about this. Chapter 3 was the first place where we connected the limbic system and emotion. And we know that the limbic system includes a lot of different areas, and so let's look at that again. Remember, the limbic system is the hippocampus, the mammillary bodies, the amygdala, hypothalamus, olfactory bulb, septum, cingulate gyrus, and fornix. Most of these areas we've hit on too. Hippocampus with memory, mammillary bodies with memory, and amygdala with aggression, and hypothalamus with the switching station, olfactory bulb with olfaction and smell, right? So most of these that we've gone throughout the book, and you're familiar with them, but as a system, as the limbic system, we can think of it as really regulating emotions. And then lastly was the Kluver-Bucy syndrome. It's a rare cerebral neurological disorder. The symptoms are memory loss, extreme sexual behavior, placidity, and visual distractibility. It results from bilateral damage to anterior temporal lobes, bilateral damage, and results may be primarily due to damage to the amygdala, right? Because the amygdala is right there at that anterior temporal lobe area. It says here, monkeys that could not be handled before surgery were transformed by bilateral anterior temporal lobectomies into tame subjects that show no fear whatsoever, even in response to snakes, which terrify normal monkeys. In primates, most of the symptoms of the Kluver-Bucy syndrome appear to result from the damage to the amygdala, a structure that has played a major role in the research on emotion, as you will learn throughout this chapter. Okay, so hopefully that gave you a little background there. We start off with Phineas Cage. We know that the frontal lobe, prefrontal lobes are responsible for calming us down, critical thinking, Darwin's theory of what works for us, and you continue to do that same thing. It evolves over time. We talked about James Lang Cannon Bard, and how now we're to this cyclical theory here with the physiological reactions and feeling of fear. Sham rage gives us an idea about the hypothalamus area, and then Kluver-Bucy gives us more information about the amygdala. Okay? All right. So emotions and the autonomic nervous system. Two important questions here. Which patterns of the ANS activity are associated with specific emotions? And then are autonomic nervous system measures effective on polygraph or the lie detector? And there is not a separate ANS profile for each emotion. So that kind of confuses things. The idea being behind that is that the fear response would cause a physiological change that is different from a happiness response, right? Or different from anxiety. So let's say that you're going on a roller coaster, okay? And the anxiety that you feel on that roller coaster causes physiological changes like butterflies in your stomach and all that kind of thing. And that physiological change in the autonomic nervous system is different than if you were to fear something. You might think to yourself, well, I still get that shortness of breath or heart rate increases and butterflies in my stomach, but it actually is affecting the autonomic nervous system in a little bit different way. Okay. And so here what's saying is that there is not a separate ANS profile for each emotion. So because you have the fear causes those symptoms, the anxiety causes those symptoms, it's very hard for us to tell them apart. So I know I kind of confused that part on you. But go back to the last bullet again. There's not a separate ANS profile for each emotion. So when you feel the physiological response, it seems to be somewhat standard over different emotions. Okay, lie detection is really emotion detection. Your book goes into two different techniques, the control question and the guilty knowledge. Okay. The control question is physiological response to a target question compared with a response to a control question. The problem with this is that what they've detected is that a lot of people, just being in the environment in which you're hooked up to the lie detector test and you have this question asked to you like, where was the gun hidden? Sometimes you get a false positive for that because of just the position. It's just the nature of the question itself. So then they came out with the guilty knowledge technique, which merely asks a question that only the culprit would know the answer to. And this seems to be a little bit, success rate is a little higher, as you can see, and it's a little bit more effective. And I actually wanted to stop here and go over your first e-lecture topic item. It says provide an example not used by your author, so nothing that you see on page 428 here, to describe the difference between the control question technique and the guilty knowledge technique. And then which technique do you believe is most effective? Okay. And I kind of alluded to that, kind of gave you the answer for that one. But I want you to give an example and go into a little bit more detail on that, if you can. Yeah. And then which technique do you believe is most effective? All right. Remember, that's e-lecture topic item number 1. It's 10 points, so I'm going to need at least a full paragraph, if not 2. All right, let's keep going. Emotions and facial expression. The meanings of facial expressions appear to be universal. This is fascinating. They've been able to go to third world countries and look at these individuals that really have very little contact with other humans. Outside of their tribe, they don't make a lot of other contact. And even when we investigated facial expressions, they seem to use the same expressions, and they seem to perceive the expressions the same, as smile being happy and frown being mad or angry or so on. 6 primary emotions. Naturally occurring expressions are usually variations or combinations of the basic ones. And so what are those basic ones? I'll show you next. Figure 17.5. Okay, so here you have anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise. Okay. 6 primary facial expressions of emotion, 1 combination facial expression, that sad eyes, happy mouth thing. But so it shows you how these, out of these 6 emotions, pretty much every other facial expression comes from them. Okay, the facial feedback hypothesis. Does smiling really make you happier? That's a good question. And they've done research on this. And they've actually placed people into 2 groups. And they tell one group, I want you to go into this room for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, and I want you to just smile. It doesn't have to be like a ludicrous laughing smile kind of thing, but just feel as though you're just smile, right? And then another group, you go in there and I want you to frown. I want you to do the opposite. You are not going to smile. And then what they did was they gave them different questions. They asked them different questions after an hour or so. And the people that were asked to not smile or frown were actually sad. They were very negative about the experiment. And the other group that was told to smile, you could think to yourself, well, they didn't do anything else, so they wouldn't be happy about it. I mean, you told them to smile and sit in this room for an hour or 2 hours, but they came out and they were actually okay with the situation. And so it says brief facial expressions reveal true feelings and may break through false ones. We know that different muscles are involved in fake and real smiles, and so there might be some truth to smiling makes you happier. All right. And then at the very bottom bullet, what the current research is actually looking at not just facial expressions, but also body cues and how those can play a major role in the expression of emotion as well. Okay, aggressive defensive behaviors. I didn't go into a lot. Your author goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to. The only reason why I bring up table 17.2 is because when we move further into some of the experiments, they talk about aggressive behaviors, they talk about fear conditioning, they talk about defensive behaviors, and so I just want to kind of give you a list of what those are. Okay, and 17.2 does a very good job of that. You have predatory aggression, social aggression. Those are both aggressive behaviors. Under defensive behaviors, you have intraspecific defense, defensive attacks, freezing and flight, maternal defensive behaviors, risk management, risk assessment, and then defensive burying. Okay, so you can think if you take the right species and you look at defensive burying, which is something that a rat might do, or some kind of a rodent, right? Then you can work with this emotion. You know that whatever you're triggering in that animal, if they start burying themselves, that's their way of they feel fearful and they need to get out of that situation. Now you do experiments on that individual, like we're doing here, lesioning the amygdala or whatever it might be, right? And then you provide them the same stimulus that caused that fear and burying behavior in the before, now doesn't cause that behavior. And so you can link the two together and say, okay, the absence of that behavior is due to this area in the brain being disrupted in some way. Just a little pause here on aggression and testosterone. Social aggression in humans does not decrease with castration or increase with testosterone injections. So a lot of people kind of, go along with, they believe that castration would definitely, decrease aggression. Violent criminals and aggressive male athletes may have high testosterone levels, but this may be the result of aggressive behavior and not the cause. There are lots of possible sources of discrepancies also. Failure of researchers to distinguish between social aggression and defensive aggression. And again, that was another reason why I wanted to show you table 17.2 so you can follow along with some of these studies and notice the difference between social aggression and defensive aggression. Okay, but we're not going to focus much more on that. So let's look at the neural mechanisms of fear conditioning. So fear conditioning, how you start with this is that you pair a neutral stimulus, like a tone, with an aversive stimulus, a shock. Okay, this is just classical conditioning. Put them into a Skinner box. You saw this in a couple chapters ago. You also saw this in chapter 5 when we were talking about the different experimental procedures used in biopsychology. So a tone goes off and the floor is shocked, right? And pretty soon, it doesn't take very long before they know that tone is not a good thing, and they become very fearful as soon as that tone comes on because they know what to expect. So then you present the tone later, and the animal will show a conditioned fear response, and usually it's a defensive behavior. Okay? So along the defensive behavior, it might be the burying, like we talked about. It might be freezing and flight, right? Amygdala and fear. Lesions of the amygdala block the fear conditioning, and the amygdala receives input from all sensory systems. So it appears to be responsible for adding emotional significance to another stimulus, and the amygdala projects to brainstem regions that control emotional behavior output. And this is shown much better in a graphic, which will be on the next slide. Okay. The structure is thought to mediate the sympathetic and behavioral responses conditioned to an auditory conditional stimulus. So you have a threatening sound. Okay, this is kind of along the same model with the tone and shock, but now we're looking at a human. Threatening sound goes into the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus was the switching station. Then the thalamus is going to send it forward. Okay. So specifically the medial geniculate nucleus, but that's in the thalamus, right? And then that can go to the auditory cortex, from the auditory cortex to the amygdala, from the amygdala to the hypothalamus, sympathetic response. Okay. It can also go directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, and then the amygdala to the hypothalamus, sympathetic response, or it can go from directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, and the amygdala to the paraqueductal gray. Okay? And then the paraqueductal gray to the behavioral response. It says here there are two pathways from the medial geniculate nucleus to the amygdala. The direct one, which you have already learned about, and an indirect one that you have that projects via the auditory cortex. Okay? Both routes are capable of mediating fear conditioning to simple sounds. If only one is destroyed, conditioning progresses normally. However, only the cortical route is capable of mediating fear conditioning to complex sounds. Okay? So because you have from the thalamus to the auditory cortex and from the thalamus directly to the amygdala, if you take the auditory cortex out of the equation, you still end up with the same fear conditioning. Okay, but just to know that there are two routes. In order to completely eliminate it, you would have to do away with the amygdala, period. Okay, brain mechanisms of human emotion. Cognitive neuroscience is a current approach to study human emotion. You now know a little bit about cognitive neuroscience. It's really the technology that we have nowadays that is changing the way that we're looking at the brain and changing the way that we're identifying really how the brain works. Brain activity associated with emotion is diffuse, right? So it's not just located in one area of the brain. If somebody is fearful, that fear response seems to be diffuse throughout the brain. Emotion, including empathy, is correlated with activity in motor and sensory cortices. Similar brain activity is associated with experienced emotion, imagined emotion, or observation of someone experiencing an emotion. Okay, so that's interesting. You see somebody who is crying and you feel for that individual, and the parts in the brain that light up are the same as if you were actually crying yourself. And again, it may indicate a mirror-like system in the brain, and we talked about mirror neurons. Remember the Jennifer Aniston neurons that we talked about a few chapters ago, and that those neurons only fire to a specific stimulus. Okay. Figure 17.10 shows you some MRIs here, and it shows you M1 is primary motor cortex, PMC is the premotor cortex, and when volunteers watch facial expressions of emotion, the same areas were active when the volunteers made the expressions themselves. Okay, so that's what I was referring to with you see somebody crying and the brain is active in the same areas in which it would be if you were crying yourself. Okay, back to the amygdala in human emotion. So the amygdalas in humans appear to have a more general role in emotions, not just fear. I think, in chapter 3, I kind of mentioned to you limbic system emotion, amygdala fear. It was kind of one of those things that just tie in together. But know that it's not just fear. It can also play a role in many emotions. The amygdala, remember that, the amygdala appears to play a role in evaluating the emotional significance of situations. Okay? Because remember, the amygdala, very close to the hippocampus, both part of the limbic system, but hippocampus was a lot about memory, right? And so it plays a role in evaluating the emotional significance. So I'm sure there's the connection there also with, oh, well, wait, I've experienced this before, right? How about the medial prefrontal lobes? Emotion and cognition are better studied as components of the same system. The medial portions of the prefrontal lobes are sites of emotion, cognition interaction. Medial prefrontal lobes are active during either emotional suppression or reappraisal, and many other roles for this area in emotion have been suggested. Likely it performs many, many functions. So again, the research is really wide open. All of these things, this is why neuroscience is so exciting, because there's a lot that's being discovered. There's a lot that new findings, but every time they find something new, they also find something that they can't figure out, right? That they just doesn't make sense. And now you're off on another track. So there's lots and lots of opportunities for new research for many, many years to come. How about the lateralization, since we brought this term up last chapter, in chapter 16? Early theories of lateralization may have been too general. It says asymmetry of facial expression studies indicate that a majority of people have right hemisphere dominance. for facial expressions. But again, that's just, they have a majority for right hemisphere dominance for facial expression studies. But again, with the proper corpus callosum, the right hemisphere might have a little bit more to do with facial expression, but then it's going to cross over both hemispheres to figure out the whole situation, and so they both work together. Again, a lot more study to this would have to be performed. So what about some current perspectives before we go on to another section of the chapter? Emotional situations produce widespread activation in the brain, not just in the amygdala. We talked about that. Brain areas activated by emotion are also activated by other psychological processes. Yes, the same emotional stimuli often activate different areas in different people. Okay, so a lot is left to be learned. All right, let's talk about stress and health. Okay, first of all, we have to define some of the terms here. Stress is a reaction to harm or threat. Stressors are stimuli that cause stress. Okay, chronic psychological stress most clearly linked to ill health. In the short term, though, stress is adaptive. In the long term, it is maladaptive. So you think to yourself, the alarm clock. Your alarm clock in the morning is a stressor. It's a stimuli that causes stress. But this is a good stress. It's a short term. It goes off a couple times, you hit it, maybe you hit too hard sometimes, but you hit it and it gets you up and moving, and you're like, okay, here, let me go. Let's get the day started, right? So it ends up being an adaptive stressor. But chronic psychological stress, being in a work environment that is very poor, or having some kind of catastrophic event occur, and it becomes a chronic issue, then those things are clearly linked to ill health. Okay, so what is the stress response? Stress triggers stress hormones. The anterior pituitary gland is involved in that. The adrenal cortex is also involved in that. Remember, we know these areas now. The pituitary gland, specifically the anterior being the master gland that we talked about, sending those hormones and so on to the adrenal cortex. Okay, and so glucocorticoids are the result, epinephrine and norepinephrine, as well as cytokines, which cause the inflammation and fever. Okay, again, one of those things where a short-term stress is also going to cause glucocorticoids. The cytokines causing inflammation and fever. You can think to yourself, some of these things are natural, some of these things definitely help us, but the problem is that when they don't shut off, okay, when the stress continues on and on and on, and you cannot cope with it, then we have a problem. Individual differences such as attitude affect the magnitude of the stress response. An example here, women awaiting surgery who were certain they did not have breast cancer had milder stress than did others. Okay, so that whole mind over matter issue, there is something to that. We don't know entirely. It's one of those things where we may never see the actual cause and effect. The power of prayer. You've heard it probably said a lot of different ways that this individual was just so motivated and so positive that cancer was not going to get them, and they succeeded. And then on the other side of the coin, you had these people where they just knew it was time and they gave up, and then therefore they died. So that's what we're talking about. All right. So here's a stressor. How it affects the brain goes to the anterior pituitary on the left-hand side to the adrenal cortex, and then the glucocorticoids. It also affects the sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal medulla, and therefore producing norepinephrine and epinephrine. All right. So psychosomatic disorders, or those disorders that can happen Psycho, right, linked to psychological, somatic are going to be body, so mind-body disorders, and one of those are gastric ulcers. These are lesions of the stomach lining, more common in those who are stressed, right? However, the bacterium for ulcers, and if any of you have ever had an ulcer or know of somebody who has had an ulcer, you will know that. I was going to look it up here and see real quick. I think it was like the pyri bacterium. There it is, pylori. Okay, the H. pylori infection. Now, the 75% of healthy subjects also have that bacterium in them. Okay, so it's one of those things where it's always kind of there. In most people, it is there, but the trigger is stress, and then it takes over and then produces the gastric ulcer. So psychoneuroimmunology, right? How does psychology influence the brain and the immune system? That's what psychoneuroimmunology is. Studying the interaction of psychological factors, the nervous system, and the immune system. Okay. So now what we have to do is, because we're talking about how psychology plays a role in the immune system, we have to discuss the immune system itself a little bit. The innate immune system is the first line of defense. It attacks generic classes of pathogens that enter the body. The adaptive immune system targets specific pathogens identified by their antigens. It has memory involved, and that's why you get that flu shot, right? That's how vaccinations work. And then cytokines activate lymphocytes, or white blood cells. So when you and I, we get sick, we have a bacterial infection, we take a blood test, it might show an elevated white blood cell count. And that means that, yeah, your body is fighting some kind of a pathogen in your system. Cell-mediated would be T lymphocytes, and antibody-mediated would be B lymphocytes. So then what effect does stress have on the immune function? Effects of stress on immune function depends on the kind of stress, right? Acute stressors improve the immune function. Chronic stressors impair the immune function. Stress that goes unmanaged, I guess you could say, right? The body can't shut off that response, and so it starts hurting the function of different things. Stress can impact immune function in many ways. Effects of stress can be good, bad, or mixed. Okay, so again, acute stressors, knowing that you have an exam on Friday, that's going to keep you alert. That's going to keep you cognizant that I need to read the chapter, I need to go over the notes. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but then chronic stress, because of some kind of a physical ailment or something like that, or like I said, a catastrophic event, you just can't shake it, it might end up playing a psychological role, and eventually a psychoneuroimmunological role, and suppress the immune system, and then therefore you get sick. And then I think the last topic basically in the chapter here is going to be on the early experience of stress. Stress or mistreatment early in life may cause brain and endocrine abnormalities later in life. So they've done these studies with rat pups handled by researchers who had more adaptive stress response in adulthood, probably due to less negative feedback from hippocampal glucocorticoid receptors. The idea being is that they have two groups of rats. One group of rat, they were cared for, they were handled, etc. The other group, they were pretty much ignored. They weren't handled by the experimenters. And so, or they lived in an environment that wasn't enriched. They had no tunnels to go through or wheels or anything like that. Later in adulthood, those rats that didn't have that kind of, or had that poor environment, had a much more negative response to a stressor. It's just, you think about it, it's kind of natural. If you've always had bad things happen to you, then when another stressor comes up, you only think about the bad. if you've had some really good successes in life and you've been able to really be productive, then you hit a stressor and you say, you know what, this is another low time in my life, but I've done it before, I'm going to do it again. Okay. A good example of epigenetic, which means not of the genes transmission, fearful, poor grooming mothers raise daughters who become fearful, poor grooming mothers. Again, okay, so that's just again showing the relationship about how early experience can cause stress later in adulthood. And then we have stress in the hippocampus. Lastly, the hippocampus has many glucocorticoid receptors. So we know that if those go unchecked, the glucocorticoids go to a higher level and cause problems for us. Following stress reduces dendritic branching and also reduces adult neurogenesis. Okay. And remember, so hippocampus, a lot of this has to do with memory and so on. So the dendritic branching is a problem. The genesis or regeneration of neurons not going to be probably possible because of this stress or severely reduced, right? And then effects blocked with an adrenalectomy and then produced with corticosteroids. The effects were blocked with the elimination or lesioning of the adrenal glands and then produced with corticosteroids. Okay, and that leads us to our e-lecture topic item number 2. It says, the author talks about early stressors in one's life and how they might affect someone for life. Given this information, how would you explain someone who is resilient? What biological differences might these people have that allows them to cope with early stressors? And so that's going to be your number 2. Hopefully you've had the ability to interact with somebody who is this resilient type. I know these people are fascinating. A lot of things happen to them. A lot of things happen to them early in life, just like we talked about. But yet they're resilient, they're succeeding, they're prosperous. I want to know more about your experience with those people, and then on a biological level, what you think might be helping them cope. Okay, and so this is also going to be your 10 points. Again, 1 to 2 full paragraphs on that, and we are done with our chapter 17.